Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam Oglesby. I'm a 78-year-old writer who lives in the South Bronx. I've written 4 books. They're memoirs. The first one, Postcards from the Past, is dedicated to my beautiful mother. The second one, Raja's book, is dedicated to my late, great tuxedo cat, Raja. The third one, with the strange title, Word Swarm, is dedicated to everybody. And the most recent book, Encounters, a Memoir, focuses on what I consider most important in my writing, which is meetings and encounters between people. And I mean all sorts of meetings and encounters, not only between family and close friends, but between you and anonymous people you meet on the street of New York City every day. Those kind of fleeting anonymous encounters that might last a few seconds and not even involve conversation. And while all of these types of meetings are meaningful, somehow I find the anonymous ones particularly meaningful, and for me, they have had life-changing significance. Well, here I am in the different stages of my life. My early years were spent on a tiny farm in a tiny village named Girdletree on the eastern shore of Maryland. I lived there with my grandmother. It was the Second World War, and my parents had deposited me with Granny because they were traveling around the United States where my father was working on military bases. And I guess they didn't want me to be a camp follower, so they deposited me with Granny. Now, living in New York City in 2017, it seems quite incredible to me that I grew up in this small place. Granny's tiny house had no central heating, no electricity, and no indoor plumbing. For plumbing, we simply went outside behind the house where there was a little outhouse covered with beautiful rose vines, and we took care of our sanitary needs out there. For lighting, Granny had kerosene lamps, and it's amazing what one kerosene lamp can do, casting a warm, bright light in a room, enough for me to do my homework and for her to read her Bible. And for heating, she cranked up the coal stove, but it was a very cold house. Now later on, my father installed modern conveniences in the house, plumbing, electricity, heating, but Granny would have none of it. She thought these improvements were frivolous luxuries, and we never used any of them. In fact, the closest I ever came to taking a bath in the new bathtub upstairs is when my mother visited one time, and with her Brownie camera, she snapped a picture of me in the bathtub with no water in the tub. I was fully clothed, and at the last minute, she took my shirt off to simulate a bath. Now later on, after the war was over, my parents collected me, and we moved to Japan, where my father was working, and my mother was working as well. She was a school teacher, and he was working on General MacArthur's staff in what was, it sounds very strange, the American occupation of Japan, which lasted from 1945 to 1953. Now, I continued to grow up in Japan and graduated from high school there, from where I went out into the wider world, where I started having my adventures and misadventures that I chronicle in my books. Now, before I dive into some of these stories, I wanted just to explore for a minute what causes writers to write, and in particular, what caused me to write these memoirs. Well, 2 things prompted me to write my memoirs: an old photo album and my birth certificate. When I changed the front number and turned 70 in 2009, it really hit me that time was at a premium, and that, to paraphrase a friend, I would probably be dust in 10 years. The old Latin phrases carpe diem, tempus fugit, and sic transit gloria rang in my head. If there were goals I still wanted to achieve, I had better not dally. Aside from my birth certificate reminding me how old I was, there was that dusty album containing pictures from the past. As often happens in life, you go looking for something, and then you find something else that's even more important. As I recall, several years ago, I was looking for a picture of my father when he was a young man. Some of his Japanese friends were organizing a tribute to the work he'd done in Japan and were assembling a story in photos of his life. I dug through the albums I had, and while doing so, I came across another picture. It was a snapshot taken with one of those primitive brownie cameras. It showed a little boy, a tow-headed white boy, standing at a wire fence, looking at three little black girls who were leaning into the wire, looking back at him. I stared at the photo for some minutes, and then I realized the little boy was me. I confirmed his identity when I flipped the picture over and saw in my mother's schoolmarm handwriting, Sammy Oglesby, Girdletree, Maryland, summer 1942. With the help of several older relatives, I reconstructed that meeting at the fence and wrote the following passage. African Americans were a sizable part of our community on the eastern shore of Maryland, but because of racial segregation, I seldom saw them. Only once did I ever meet African American children my own age. It was by chance and for less than a minute, the time it takes to pluck ripe tomatoes from a few vines. During the high season, tomato pickers swarmed the field near our farm. I used to watch them behind the wire fence bordering our property. One day as I clung to the fence, gazing at the rows of workers, three little black girls approached and grabbed the wire. For a few seconds, we swung together on the fence in a childishly improvised game, laughing as the fragile barrier sagged. One girl, a scholarly-looking child wearing wire-rimmed glasses, tweaked my nose and said she wanted to marry me. Then she was gone as her parents moved to pick another row. From that brief fence-swinging courtship, I never had the chance to speak to an African American socially until I went to high school in Japan more than 12 years later. Well, the years passed, and I kept thinking about that long ago encounter. Where were these little girls now? What had they done with their lives? What were they thinking when they saw me over 70 years ago, peering at them through a wire fence? I thought of other passing encounters with people whom I would never know or speak to again. I recall once in Saigon, Vietnam, during the war, coming out of a building with a group of high-ranking American Army officers. We were walking to waiting chauffeur-driven limousines that would take us to inspect some project that was designed to win hearts and minds and turn the war around in our favor. Everything was spit and polished, gleaming vehicles, highly polished shoes, crisp uniforms adorned with stars and eagles. As we proceeded, walking almost in lockstep, I looked to my right and saw behind barbed wire only a few feet away scores of emaciated Vietnamese laborers staring at us with empty eyes. My gaze locked with one of them who was staring at us. Who was he? What was he thinking? Did he hate us? Then there was a time traveling overland from Arusha, Tanzania to Nairobi, Kenya, when our United Nations Land Rover stopped for a few seconds so somebody could take a photograph of the wildlife grazing on the distant savannah. As soon as our vehicle stopped, we were swarmed by tribespeople suddenly appearing from out of nowhere. They pressed their faces against the vehicle windows and looked at us as though we were curious creatures in a cage. Perhaps we were. I found myself thinking, what was their life expectancy? What made these people happy? What made them sad? Human contact, however fleeting and seemingly impersonal, is a powerful experience. Closer to home, I thought of the encounters I had had in my life and wondered if writing about them would tell me anything that would guide me in those few years I had left before turning to dust, as my friend said we all surely would. I thought the photograph of the little girls and me would make a fitting cover for a memoir about encounters and relationships and what makes them so rewarding and challenging at the same time. I hope these three little girls are happy wherever they are. They are probably older and wiser than I am. We're going to stay in the Girdle Tree, my little village, for a bit, and I want to tell you about what my life was like there as a child and about my special friend. Until I started first grade at the two-room schoolhouse a mile up the road from Granny's, I almost never encountered a child my own age, let alone had a friend who was a contemporary. The closest thing I had to a friend was the ill-tempered Ms. Adlet, a cranky old woman almost as wide as she was tall, which was well under 5 feet. Ms. Adlet lived in the tiniest of houses down the road on the way to town. At Miss Idlet's house, I was always offered something to eat, mostly items of uncertain provenance and freshness. That was before use-by came into fashion, and I remember more than once Ms. Idlet surreptitiously scraping greenish mold from a curling piece of bread before offering it to me. Almost no conversation passed between us, and I spent most of my visits there watching Ms. Idlet smoke cigarettes. I had never seen a woman smoke before, and Ms. Idlet had a particularly fascinating way of dealing with her vice. Somehow, she managed to double inhale so that smoke ingested into her mouth would be blown out shortly after the puff and re-inhaled into her nostrils, creating a dragonish effect that absolutely fascinated me. I could sit for hours on end watching her double inhale, and she accommodated me by chain smoking one Camel after another. Now, Ms. Idlet did have one story she used to tell me from time to time, and that was about how she had vomited up her tonsils when she was a little girl. When I visited her, I constantly nagged Ms. Idlet to repeat her gruesome tonsil tale. And it was only when she was in the best of moods that she would accommodate me with this disgusting, wonderful account. When I asked her why she had regurgitated her tonsils instead of going to the hospital to have them removed as I did, she replied, "'Cause they was rotten. End of story. You had enough, Sammy Oglesby. You are one strange child, if I do say so." Now, while all the other little boys in the village were out on the playground beating each other up and playing baseball, I was in Ms. Idlet's kitchen watching her smoke and dreaming my dreams. I guess you could say I was a different kind of child. Now we're going to move from the tiny village of Girdle Tree to the bustling metropolis of Bangkok, Thailand, and I'm going to tell you about what happened on my very first day of work there with the United Nations. I worked most of my life, professional life, with the UN, the United Nations Development Program, nearly 30 years, and almost all of that time was in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. and my first assignment, where I was for 5 years, was in Bangkok. And we're going to have to skip from Girdle Tree to Bangkok thousands of miles and many decades in the interest of our time limits here today. So I'm not going to be able to regale you about my less than distinguished academic career, where I somehow managed in 5 years to stumble through college between hangovers and get a bachelor's degree, or how I somehow ended up in a place called the Kingdom of Libya, where I was in the US Army and where I avoided the dreaded kitchen patrol, KP, by feeding the first sergeant's Venus flytrap every morning. Or how I ended up in the Vietnam War, where I was for 2 years between 1966 and 1968. That was a very intense period in my life. I saw a lot of violence, killing, senseless, horrible things happening, and it affected me intensely, and it radicalized me socially and politically. But I think we need to move on. Bangkok is calling, and I want to tell you what happened on my very first day of work in Bangkok. The next morning was my first day of work, and I prepared carefully for it, selecting a wardrobe that would impress my new boss and his colleagues. My new boss's name was Wali Shah Wali, and he was an Afghan prince. I knew the importance of appearances, especially with people like that, so I dressed carefully. I had to come across as a serious young professional. Ready to begin my new life, I stepped out onto the street in the pouring rain. It was the monsoon season in Bangkok at that time, holding an umbrella with one hand while I gripped my briefcase with the other. I decided to walk to the office from the hotel nearby, since it was only 2 blocks away, and in any case, getting a taxi would not have been easy. So there I was, walking along the crowded street, jostling umbrellas with other people trying to keep my feet dry, when I noticed to my right there was a stall where a portly Thai lady was selling fried bananas. The aroma of the bananas hit my nose, and I realized I'd been so nervous and preoccupied with my appearance in my elaborate toilet that I hadn't even had breakfast that morning. The banana lady caught my eye and seemed to have a frown on her face. Maybe she didn't like foreigners. I heard that the Thais were friendly people, but there's always a bad apple in every crowd. Suddenly she started yelling at me and gesturing. How could I possibly know what she was trying to say? Even if I spoke Thai, and I was planning on learning it, I couldn't actually hear what she was going on about because of the noisy downpour. I'd better ignore her, or there might be trouble. Well, I took a few more steps, and suddenly, in less than a second, I had disappeared. I found myself neck deep in water, having fallen feet down through an open manhole into a sewer. Still submerged, I kept holding the umbrella and my attaché case. I must have looked like the fall guy in a Charlie Chaplin film. At that point, a mangy pop-eyed dog with a curly tail wandered out of a shop house, splashed through the water, and approached me. Curious, he sniffed my face, then turned, showed me his backside, and walked away, no longer interested. I looked up at the banana lady, who had hurried toward me from behind her stall. She had the girth of a sumo wrestler. Bending over me with the strength of Godzilla, she and her helper scooped me up by the armpits, and in one powerful sweep had lifted me up, plunked me down, and had me standing on my feet, still holding the briefcase and my umbrella. She clacked and cackled, pointing down to the spot where the manhole was, concealed by the muddy floodwater. Now I realized why she was frowning when she saw me. Well, within 24 hours of my arrival in Thailand, I had been baptized, rescued by a banana lady, and taught a lesson. In life, expect the unexpected and don't let it bother you when it happens. Every morning till I moved to my house on the river, I passed the banana lady and we had a good laugh. She was the first in a collection of Bangkok characters who would fill my life over the next 5 years. Neither of us had reached nirvana yet, but we were trying as best we could. Now we're going to move from Thailand to Colombo, Sri Lanka. During my time with the UN in Asia, I traveled a lot, both on business and for vacation. And during one vacation trip, I discovered Sri Lanka, which is a paradise, a beautiful country with wonderful people. So I used to go back quite often to Sri Lanka. I made friends there, and one friend in particular, Trevor, I used to stay with him and his family when I went to Colombo, because his father was head of the Sri Lankan police, and there were always interesting people coming and going in the house, and always something to hear about. Now the story I'm going to tell you now is a very sad tale of cross-cultural communications with a tragic end. And it shows what can happen when wires get crossed and cross-cultural communications go awry and are misunderstood. My friend Trevor had befriended Hans, a hippie Dutchman who was a poet and a painter, but looked more like a bookkeeper. He lived in a tiny room in the working class section of Colombo and invited us to tea one day. The tea was elaborately prepared over a campfire single-burner gas stove, and Hans's teacups were old baked bean tins he'd salvaged from the garbage and washed off. The tins' lids were still attached to the tops and hung over like tongues and were used as handles. He gave us tiny sections of toilet paper to insulate our fingers from the scalding metal, and served us some tired little biscuits on sections of cardboard. I found this rustic hospitality to be charming and genuine. Hans told us he was only living in Colombo in this primitive state until he could build his dream house under a coconut tree in a village near the beach. He said he'd already chosen the spot, and he promised to invite us when his dream house had been completed. Now, when I was back in Colombo a year later, I inquired about Hans, and Trevor told me that the Dutchman's plans had turned into disaster. After moving to the village and building his dream house, tensions with the villagers began to arise. It seemed the Dutchman could not accustom himself to rural Sri Lankan life. The culture of collective living was alien to him. When neighbors borrowed his tools without asking and ate the fruit from the trees in his garden, he threatened them. With the constant drumbeat of village festivals that lasted for days on end, Hans would cover his ears and scream at the savages. Trevor visited Hans once in the village and cautioned him that he was the guest and had to learn to adapt to the culture of the village and not vice versa. But Hans told Trevor he was a racist and wouldn't listen to what he said. Now, sometime after Hans's confrontation in the village, Trevor's father heard from police sources that the remains of a European body had been found hacked to death on the beach near Gaul. We later learned that it was Hans. The clash between modern lifestyle and traditional culture plays itself out in many ways and in various locations with a multitude of different actors. Usually because of their wealth and power, Westerners prevail, but not always. The massive movement of people across frontiers and cultures has become a leading theme in 21st century life. How it will play itself out is anyone's guess. A melting pot can become a murderous cauldron if social engineering and mass emotion take the wrong direction. Sri Lanka itself is just now emerging from more than 3 decades of communal strife with great loss of life. And it's not an exaggeration to say that the country had come close to self-destruction. It's anybody's guess whether one of the most beautiful, blessed places in the world will rise from the ashes or sink again into strife. R.I.P., rest in peace, Hans. Now, no memoir would be complete without a mother story, and here is my mother story.
So pretty.
A vivid memory from 1948, when I was 8 years old, keeps coming back to me at bedtime when I'm about to doze off. My mother's bending over me as I lie in bed, looking up at her. We're living in Japan, in Tokyo, and she's about to go off to a party with my father, a geisha party that will last long into the night. As she leans near my face, I smell her scent of Chanel No. 5, mixed with the faint perfume of a gin martini coming from her mouth, vivid with bright red lip rouge. As she kisses me on the cheek, glossy hairs from her mink coat brush my forehead, and a string of cool, milky pearls dip from her neck, touching my throat. Nearly 40 years old, she is at the height of her beauty, and middle age seems far away. No gray hairs have yet to appear in her crown of dark locks, worn in a 1920s bob cut. She and my father will be going out to one of those marathon Japanese parties where everybody is forced to perform. With her velvety voice, my mother always sings songs to great acclaim and is especially popular with Japanese who've never seen a gaijin, foreign woman, before. Her standard numbers are Hoagie Carmichael's Stardust and China Night, Shiina no Yoru, which she renders in Japanese. Shiina no Yoru, Shiina no Yoru yo, Minato no Akari, Shina musume, ayo, ayo. She sings these songs often in our house as she works, practicing for these nights out. My mother seems gay and sophisticated as she says goodnight and tells me not to be afraid of the dark. I have always been terrorized by the night, and each creak of our earthquake-proof house, shuddering with the passage of every truck on the nearby highway, drives me to distraction. Mother knows this and tries to soothe me into sleep before she leaves. In spite of her party face and her good time behavior, Mother is a shy person, filled with insecurity. Beautiful, she is unsure of her looks, and nearly 5 feet 10 and almost 3 inches taller than my father, she feels freakish, not statuesque. A teetotaler her whole life, her new persona as a bottoms-up, let the good times roll party girl seems an uneasy role she tries too hard to play. I hear her being happy, and I know her laugh is too high-pitched and almost desperate sounding. I sense she plays this game for my father, to make him happy, to be the perfect trophy wife of a successful man. Our life in Japan seems surreal to me. I go to a school where large chunks of pages have been cut from our social studies textbooks and replaced with brownish slabs of cardboard. The Cold War has just made its debut, and any mention of the Soviet Union has been judged taboo. Maps on the classroom wall show this vast area called USSR, a huge lumbering animal straddling the globe from Europe to China, but we have no idea what's happening in this gigantic expanse. Our barracks-like living quarters are surrounded by a lawn devoid of any pleasing vegetation. On the back side of the house is a road along which trucks rumble day and night, With each passage of a vehicle, our wooden and stucco structure shudders in imitation of an earth tremor. I long for the friendly familiarity of our village on the eastern shore of Maryland. Left alone in my room, I fall into a fitful slumber after hours of watching leaping shadows dance on the wall. As dawn breaks, I think I hear a car door slam and what sounds like a woman moaning and crying in pain. I look out my bedroom window, barely able to see the image below on the street as light breaks into the eastern sky. My mother's head is hanging out of the window of our Chevrolet and she is vomiting. Her vomit streaks the car door and her beautiful fur coat is covered with mucus. A lump forms in my throat as I watch my parents below. My mother continues to vomit and sob while my father stands by the car door, watching, speechless, seemingly helpless to do anything. I want to rush down and comfort my beautiful, helpless mother, who until now has always seemed so strong and in control, but I do nothing, sadness and anger welling up in me. Half a century later, I hear a song by Peggy Lee called Is That All There Is? She sings about a raging fire that burns her house down, and when the fire is over, she asks, is that all there is to a fire? Then she goes to a circus, and after watching clowns cavort, elephants prance, and trapeze artists defy death, she asks again, is that all there is to a circus? Finally, she sings about how she falls in love and how sad she feels when the boy leaves her, concluding with, is that all there is to love? 70 years after that morning in Japan, I watch my mother struggle out of our Chevy, and I think, is that all there is to a party?
Thank you.